morning. Years and years ago, Maurice and I had been reading through Oswald J. Smith's book entitled Compassion for Lost Souls. It was a very good book, but rarely made any impression on me, probably because I was so self-centered and couldn't identify with or have compassion for other people and their situations. But that particular day, God spoke loudly and clearly. In the chapter we were reading, Smith was talking about an African man who desperately wanted to be the new witch doctor, as the village witch doctor had just died. So he went into the heart of the jungle and fasted for 7 whole days. And when he'd ended his fast, he was totally possessed by evil spirits and could do all sorts of magic, which now qualified him for the position. Maurice and I had just received some very detailed teaching from the Sermon on the Mount, so I was fully aware that fasting was supposed to be an integral part of the Christian's life. As Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, verse 16, "Moreover, when you fast, be not as the hypocrites of a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces, that they may appear unto men to fast. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that you appear not unto men to fast, but unto your Father which is in secret. And your Father which sees in secret shall reward you openly." If you notice his wording, he said, when you fast. He didn't say, if you fast. Knowing all about fasting is one thing, but putting it into practice is quite another. This African man had given 7 complete days of his life in total abstinence to be possessed of evil spirits. And yet, I'd never even given God 1 day. Okay, I'd given up a meal here and there, but I'd never allowed myself to be put at God's disposal. I always only did what I could handle myself. And now, God was challenging me to give him a whole week to fast on water and pray so that he could possess and use me. And because I knew without a shadow of a doubt that God was telling me to do this, I was really frightened. I knew it was useless to stay at home where the biscuit barrel and the bread bin would be shouting my name, and I'd feel powerless to refuse. I had to get away completely, away from all temptation, to enable me to fulfill the obligation which I now owed to God. As it happened, I was reading through a Redemption Tidings magazine, so you can tell how long ago it was, and I came across an advert offering holiday accommodation in a cottage in Matlock, Derbyshire, for the week of the Assemblies of God conference. Obviously, the owners had wanted to go to the conference but didn't want their home to be left vacant, so they were offering it for rental. I made contact with the owners and found out that they were the wardens of the Eventide Home for Elderly Christians, which was on the same road as their cottage, just 5 doors away, and that their church was just around the corner, where they assured me that I'd be very welcome. Well, I arrived in Matlock, armed with my Bible, my hymn book, and the prophecy journal, which I'd kept ever since God had started speaking personally to me, and was shown around the cottage by people standing in for the owners. Although I didn't have a television myself, I was very relieved to find that there was one here, because I thought at night, when I'd be feeling very lonely, I'd be able to turn it on and have some company. But just before my guides left, they informed me that I wouldn't be able to use the television, as something had been removed due to the fact that the licence fee hadn't been paid. Well, as soon as I was alone, I made a more detailed inspection of the house to see what facilities there actually were for me. And I found there was no radio, no cassette player. The telephone had a lock on which enabled calls to come in, but none to go out. And nobody knew I was there except Maurice, who'd be collecting me in a week's time. I suddenly felt very frightened and vulnerable because I was totally alone. God had asked me to spend the week with him, but now I was wondering if I actually really knew him. I'd served him for years in the church and met regularly with other Christians for spiritual activities, but this was different. I reckoned it would be best if I could work out a schedule for the week, so I decided to spend 2 hours in prayer and Bible reading in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon, and 2 hours in the evening. My spirit was very willing, but my flesh was incredibly weak. I hadn't taken into account the violent headaches that began to attack me. Being a very healthy and strong-minded person normally, I was totally unprepared for the weakness that came over my body as soon as I stopped eating. And this weakness seemed to affect everything I did. As the week progressed, I found that reading the Bible became impossible. The words would all jumble together and become a blur. My vision couldn't take in or focus on what I was looking at, and my mind began to wander. And I found it impossible to concentrate for long periods of time to pray. Well, on the Wednesday evening, the deputy at the Eventide home called round to see me, asking if I'd like to give a word to the old people the following morning. She knew I'd come away to spend this week as a retreat and thought that maybe I could give some sort of testimony which would encourage the residents. I was amazed because an immediate response came out of my mouth before I could catch the words, and I'd accepted her invitation. Then for about 10 minutes after she'd gone, the Lord just cleared my mind, and I was able to write down the outline for a 30-minute sermon which I could preach the next day. But then my mind became a blur again and I couldn't concentrate. Well, that night I had a terrible battle. I'd run a bath, and as I sank beneath the water, I felt the heat of the water surge through my body, bringing on with it a stomach cramp. I'd only ever read about them in fasting books. It was a horrifying and fearful experience. I began to palpitate so much that I thought my heart would burst. Strength completely left me, and I couldn't raise myself out of the water. I was really frightened, and I actually thought I'd die in the bath. In my imagination, I could see newspaper headlines: "Stupid Christian drowns in the bath while fasting." Must have taken all of 10 minutes to gradually drag my body out of that water, and even longer to get down the stairs to boil some water for a warm drink and fix up a hot water bottle to place on my stomach. But God pulled me through. The next morning, after only 4 hours sleep again, I wearily made my way down the road to the home, wondering how on earth I was going to face these people with my mind so confused and so blurred. I rang the bell, and as soon as I was admitted, my head miraculously cleared and strength surged through my body. So much so that I was able to sing and play the piano for the old people with gusto. I gave my 30-minute sermon about the dangers of old age, and at the end, the listeners were in tears, asking God to help them with their own prayer lives. I felt alert and bright-eyed as I chatted with the deputy warder after the meeting, and almost ran back to the cottage to get down to my own personal prayer and Bible reading. I thought the Lord had taken me out of that first stage of fasting and cleared my mind completely so I could now be spiritually alert and sharp. But as soon as I put my key into the door and stepped inside the cottage, this miraculous strength just flowed from me and I was totally exhausted. I picked up my Bible and I tried to pray, putting all the effort I could muster in. But it just seemed like a waste because I couldn't remember anything I read or anything I'd said in prayer. But what an incredible spiritual experience I'd just had. Because I'd obeyed God by fasting, God had opened the door and I'd been transported from the physical realm of total weakness and been allowed to operate with divine strength in the spiritual realm. I knew what had happened at that old people's home was all of God and none of me. And I'd actually experienced it for myself for that very short period. But now the job was done. I was sapped of all that spiritual energy. The virtue had just gone out of me. When God called me to give him this week, I truly and sincerely felt that I'd break through into the spiritual realm to see God in a fresh way. But as far as I was concerned, it had been an utter failure. My physical weakness from lack of food was only proving to emphasize the stark reality of my true spiritual state with God. I was totally impoverished. And yet, for all this feeling of failure and inadequacy, my first meal to break the fast filled me with a great sense of satisfaction. After all, I just completed, for the very first time in my life, 7 whole days on water. The food strengthened my body like magic, and I instantly felt strong both physically and spiritually. I remembered the reading that Morris and I had concerning the man who wanted to be a witch doctor, and my heart filled with aspirations for what God could now do through me after giving him a week of my life in the same manner. I could imagine myself healing the sick and casting out devils and doing all the things that he commanded his apostles to do. And I couldn't wait to get back to the church to see what God was going to do in my life now. Looking back, I'm amazed at how quickly pride overtook my feeling of failure. But God was good, and he didn't allow me to stay in that situation for long. In fact, the week after the fast, I was still riding on high on my spiritual cloud, which inevitably left me very vulnerable to the attacks of Satan. Morris had often reminded me of something his father had said concerning war tactics. He'd said you're at your most vulnerable just after a victory. That's the very time the enemy usually plans an attack and wins, because you're off your guard. Well, during my Christian walk, I'd had about 4 besetting sins, which I'd begged God to deliver me from, and in his mercy, he'd come to my rescue. But the very first week following the fast, Satan tested me again with these 4 things. And I fell for every one of them. I was absolutely bewildered. Surely, after the fast, I should be more spiritual rather than more carnal. The tremendous guilt I felt drove me to prayer, and God spoke to me, teaching me 3 very important lessons. Number 1, God reminded me that my fast wasn't a voluntary sacrifice. He challenged me to do it. He told me that if I'd refused to do the fast, I'd have been disobedient, in which case I should have deserved punishment. The fact that I'd been obedient didn't entitle me to a reward. It meant I was simply fulfilling my obligation to God, whom I claimed was my Lord and Master. Number 2, God told me that I should never fast with the motive of trying to force him to do anything. Actually, personal fasting is meant to be practiced by Christians with the purpose of humbling themselves and taking their minds off their own wants and needs for a period of time to concentrate on God and his will. Number 3, God finally drove it home to me just who I was. Joanna Barratt, flesh and blood. And my own human nature would always desire to fulfill the lusts of the flesh. He showed me that the only chance I have for overcoming myself is to feed the new nature which he gave me when I became a Christian and continually walk in the Spirit. When I got back home to Manchester, I prayed in all sincerity that God would never ask me to do a fast like that again, as I didn't want to refuse and be disobedient. But the very next year, God told me to again fast. I'm amazed at how God has taught me to trust him, because even though I knew what to expect and was scared stiff, I did what I asked and I put myself at his disposal. I'm very, very grateful to say that from that initial fast to this present day, he's never put me through that experience again. God must have given me a baptism of fire to see how I'd respond to rough handling. I'm really glad I didn't refuse, because he's treated me so well and blessed me so much ever since. As I look back, I'm amazed at the way I used to think about myself as a Christian. Before this fast, I thought I'd grown, that I'd changed. But God showed me that wasn't so. If he'd taken his hand off me at any moment, I'd have immediately reverted to type. The only reason I change is because I'm putting spiritual laws into operation and practicing what the Bible tells me to do, which gives God the opportunity to alter my thinking and my actions. I'm ashamed to say it, but I used to accredit all those changes to my own spirituality. And without realizing it, I'd become very self-righteous. What I had expected would be a spiritual high turned out to be a very humbling experience. But I've since learned to thank God for these apparent times of failure, as in actual fact, they are all blessings in disguise. At least, I now know the truth. And the Bible says that the truth, even about myself, will make me free. May it make you free too. God bless you.